So welcome to the Diplomat with Stephen Taylor. Thank you very much for taking the time out and joining us today. Today, joined by an amazing lady all the way from Australia, Gita. I'm not going to try and pronounce your surname. You can help me out with that. The High Commissioner of Australia. Gita, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks very much, Steve. It's great to be here.
How do we say your surname?
Okay, so it's an Indian surname. It's pronounced Kamath.
Oh, Kamath. Okay. All right. So you were born in Australia?
No, I'm one of the 1 in 4 Australians who was born overseas, and one of the 1 in 2 Australians who has at least one parent that was born overseas. So I was born in India.
Oh, I like that. Okay. What part of India?
I was born in the state of Tamil Nadu, where my parents were working at the time. My father was an Indian national, but my mother was a Malaysian citizen. So at a very young age, we moved to Malaysia, where I spent the first 7 years of my life before migrating to Australia in the 1970s, just after the end of the White Australia policy.
Okay, and so you moved to Australia when? In the 70s?
Yes, just at the beginning of 1974.
Okay,
just
and where did
policy had been lifted.
Okay. So you grew up in India and went to school in India?
No, so I was born in India, and as a baby we moved to Malaysia, where my mother had grown up.
Okay.
And then we migrated to Australia in the early 70s. It was an interesting time in Malaysia where they had a lot of race problems and race riots, and my father wasn't a citizen, and so he wasn't able to get citizenship. And at that time, Australia was ending the White Australia policy and were looking for doctors. So you saw that a lot of Chinese and Indian doctors from Malaysia migrated to Australia at that time. My parents are both doctors.
You're not a doctor.
I come from a family of doctors, though.
Oh, okay. There's enough doctors then. Okay, so tell us about, so then you moved to Australia in the 70s, and then growing up, how old were you when you went to Australia?
7.
Oh, 7. Oh, wow. Oh, so you still continued school in Australia when you were there?
It all pretty much, except for a little bit in Malaysia, all my primary, secondary and university education in Australia, in Sydney.
Okay. And tell us about how you're, like, growing up, like wanting to get into the civil service in representing your country, in this case, Australia. How did that come about?
Well, I was working as a lawyer. When I left university, I did a law degree, an arts law degree, and I worked in a large commercial law firm. And then I was aware that they had an entrance process to get into the Australian Public Service. And you had to, at that time, identify 3 departments that you wanted to work in. And my number 1 choice was the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. That's the equivalent here in South Africa of DIRCO, the Department of International Relations and Cooperation. And it was a very lengthy process. You know, they look at your academic record. It actually took most of the year, actually, to find out whether I got in or not. And they had group interviews, one-on-one interviews. They had a very interesting process where they got us to watch a video of 2 diplomats having a conversation, 2 officials having a conversation, and then we had to quickly write it up. And I learned later on that this is one of the sort of stocks in trade of diplomats. It's called, we call them rocks. Now, I'm not talking about geological formations or stones. It stands for Record of Conversation, and it's something that junior diplomats have to learn to master. There's quite an art to it. And so we had to do this as part of the process, is to quickly do a rock and write up a conversation. And there really is quite an art to it, because it's not just a verbatim sort of transcript of what people are saying. You have to be able to summarize the key points. Often it's not necessarily in the order in which it was said. You've got to be able to convey the tone and the context, and, you know, work out, recommend next steps. So I guess they wanted to see, as raw sort of recruits, what our ability was to do a rock.
So I better say the right things because you're a lawyer, eh? So transcending from being a lawyer to going into the diplomatic service, that's an interesting one.
Well, actually, we have a lot of law graduates who come into the Foreign Service. I'd say at least
really?
half of the people in my graduate year who entered the department were law graduates. And I think that's
Wow.
because often law graduates don't practice law because it's like it gives you certain, it helps you to develop certain skills in terms of writing, reasoning, advocating, judgment. So I think a lot of those skills have been very useful in the Foreign Service. But I have to say, I've had what's called a generalist career in the Australian Foreign Service. I've been a diplomat for more than 25 years, but I have had what we call a career anchor, which is the law. And so while I've worked in many, many different areas in the department, whether it's on, you know, arms control, so nuclear non-proliferation, and there's a lot of treaties, international law underneath that, whether it's on treaty negotiations, so I've done sea law negotiations. Once again, there's a strong legal underpinning. I've worked on agricultural trade negotiations, so that in the WTO, the World Trade Organization, a lot of legal underpinnings there as well. So I found that the legal skills have been very useful. I've been our corporate legal counsel as well in the department. So, yeah.
So 25 years in the diplomatic service, but you still look so young. What is your secret, Gita? Please tell us.
You should be a diplomat, Steve.
Yeah. It's less stressful than being a lawyer, right? Is that why you chose that?
I worked for, I shouldn't say this for those lawyers who are working in large corporate law firms, but when I worked as a lawyer for 2 years, it was stressful, but I also thought it was boring. So I thought that was a terrible combination, stressful and boring. And I thought, well, there's got to be better things. And I've never looked back.
Wow, that's good. So what are some of the postings, some of the roles that you've had within the department? Where have you been posted around the world?
So my first posting, I was sent to Indonesia as a very young, you know, diplomat. And I was doing long-term language training in Indonesia. Unfortunately, it was at a time when there was severe budget cuts across the Australian public service. And so they took a kind of last in, first out approach. So I finished all my language training. I came back to Australia and then I got sent to Singapore. So that was really, you know, my proper first posting after doing long-term language training and speaking fluent Indonesian. And so I went to Singapore and as a second secretary, working on political issues. And it was a fascinating time in the 1990s when we had the Asian financial crisis. And a very, you know, great place to be based in the middle of Southeast Asia, and a good opportunity as well to travel and see a lot of Southeast Asia. Then I took some time off for 3 years in France because my husband's French and I had a couple of kids. I had one child on posting in Singapore, so I was out of the workforce for 3 years, came back, worked, as I mentioned before, in our corporate area, headed up our performance management unit, then worked on arms control, on nuclear non-proliferation, then was our corporate legal counsel, and then I went on posting to Paris. Yes,
you've been to some nice places, man. Wow. I should become a diplomat.
That was a wonderful posting, both professionally and personally, because my husband is from Paris. And my kids are bilingual and their grandparents live in Paris. So that was a wonderful posting. And I wore a couple of different hats in Paris. I was our deputy head of mission in our bilateral embassy. And I was also our ambassador to UNESCO, the UN, United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization. So it was very interesting to work in the field of multilateral diplomacy as well.
Okay, and then moving ahead now to your role as the Australian High Commissioner, what is the difference between an ambassador and a High Commissioner? Is it the same thing, really?
It is the same thing. The difference is we have High Commissions in Commonwealth countries.
Okay.
So, so I'm the High Commissioner to South Africa because Australia and South Africa are both Commonwealth countries, but I'm the ambassador to Angola. So I also cover 7 countries. I have non-resident accreditation to 7 countries in the Southern African region. Most of them are Commonwealth countries, so I'm the High Commissioner to those countries, except with the exception of Angola, which is not a Commonwealth country, so I'm an ambassador there.
So how many countries do you represent currently at the moment?
7. I haven't yet presented credentials in Lesotho. That's the last of the 7, but I've presented credentials in all the rest. So I have to remember them all: Angola, Botswana, Mozambique, Lesotho, South Africa, Namibia, and Eswatini.
Wow, that's a lot of places. So you have to travel from time to time. Well, are you still able to travel now or not really? So you're based here in South Africa, though.
Borders. I'm in Pretoria, so the borders are effectively shut at the moment. So since late March, when the borders closed and flights were grounded, we haven't been able to travel outside. So I look forward to doing that again, because that's a very important part of our role, is to be able to get out to the countries of accreditation.
Yes. Okay. So you've only just recently arrived here in South Africa, then? Is that the case?
I arrived this time a year ago.
Okay. And how has the role been here? Is it your first posting as a High Commissioner Ambassador?
Well, I was ambassador to UNESCO, and when I was in Paris, I mentioned I wore a number of hats. I was also in Paris, our non-resident ambassador to Chad and the Central African Republic. So I had the opportunity to travel there a number of times and will present credentials and represent Australia to those countries. Yes. So
have you ever been? Had you been to South Africa before you came here?
I had been once, actually. I'd been for work, because my last role before I came here was I headed up our Africa branch so I came in for work. But I came actually just after the end of apartheid on holidays with my husband, which was a fascinating time to be in South Africa. Just a short time, because one of my colleagues was our Deputy High Commissioner at the time, so we came to visit her. And we only spent a short time here on holidays, but wow, what a fascinating time in South Africa in the mid-90s.
South Africa's got a lot of history, but I also know that there's a lot of South Africans that live in Australia. Tell us about that.
There certainly is. I was the latest statistics from the Australian Bureau of Stats. You might be surprised to know, Steve, that South Africans in Australia are now the 7th largest migrant group in Australia.
Wow. I can imagine.
And Australia is a country of migrants, so that's quite a special figure. There's close to 200,000 South African-born Australians now. So, and I think that, that really underpins the bilateral relationship between Australia and South Africa, the very strong people-to-people links. And even in the short time I've been here, I've traveled around, and so if I could have 100 rand for every time someone says they have a connection with Australia, whether it's a relative living in Australia, or someone studying in Australia, or they've traveled to Australia on holidays. And I think it's a two-way street. So Australians love South Africa as well. So we also have, I think Australians are now the 6th or 7th largest source of tourists to South Africa outside of Africa. Wow.
Yeah. Except when it comes to sport, Gita, because the rugby and the cricket's a bit of a controversial one, eh?
Yeah, and also women's sports, so netball and soccer. So South Africa is going to be hosting the Women's World Netball Championships in 2023, and we have fierce rivals as well in women's.
Absolutely. So tell us about your role here as the High Commissioner to Australia in South Africa and the other countries that you serve. What are you wanting to achieve while you are here as High Commissioner?
Well, as I said, we already have a very broad and deep relationship, and I'd like to, of course, strengthen that as much as I can in lots of different fields. I think there's a lot of commonalities between Australia and South Africa. We're both democratic countries. We're both, proudly multicultural, and we both sort of have shared values when it comes to recognising the importance of what we call a rules-based international order. And I think that's been highlighted by the COVID crisis, if anything, that, we need to have international cooperation on some of these global challenges. If we're going to try and find solutions to global challenges, it has to be through international cooperation, and it has to be through a rules-based system. And I think we find that we work closely with South Africa in a number of international and regional organisations, such as, we mentioned the Commonwealth, but also the G20. So when it talks coming into economic cooperation, which has been very important in during the COVID crisis, when you look at the breakdown of supply chains and transport links and trade links. We are both with South Africa as members of the World Trade Organization, and we're both in a group in the World Trade Organization called the Cairns Group, which was formed in Cairns, Australia in the 1980s, and it's a group of agricultural exporting countries. So we have very strong similarities with South Africa when it comes to agriculture and promoting agricultural trade and free trade in agriculture. We have, you know, close cooperation in the field of human rights. So Australia and South Africa are both currently on the UN Human Rights Commission. We are both in the same sort of geographic region, the Indian Ocean region. We both border the Indian Ocean. So there is a regional organisation called the Indian Ocean Rim Association that we're both members of. So we have good cooperation in these international bodies. And bilaterally, I mentioned the people-to-people links, but because of these people-to-people links, I think it's probably not surprising that we have very strong trade and investment links, which I'm looking to build on. So South Africa is by far and away our largest trading partner in the African continent. And we also have very healthy investment links. And people are often surprised to learn that Australia invests as much in South Africa as South Africa invests in Australia.
Wow.
And it's, yeah, and there's a lot of foreign direct investment. We are the, I think, the 7th largest foreign country investor in South Africa. And we're the biggest investor in South Africa's mining sector. And last year, our two-way investment relationship was valued at something like, I think, I have to look at my notes here, but I think it was close to 165 billion rand.
Sure.
So I'm very keen to promote and grow the bilateral trade investment relationship. About 5 years ago, we formed a bilateral chamber of commerce. It's called ABSCA, the Australian Business Chamber in Southern Africa. It's based in Joburg. And so we're always looking to grow the ABSCA membership. So that's an important role for us. We also, during the COVID crisis, have played quite an important role on consular issues. So because, once again, of the people-to-people links, there were a lot of Australians who got stuck in South Africa when the borders closed and flights were grounded. So we had doing a lot of work on repatriations on flights, and over 800 Australians were able to leave the country through 4 repatriation flights with Qantas and SAA. We have surprisingly strong links when it comes to science and technology. People are often surprised to learn that Australia and South Africa are going to co-host the world's largest radio telescope.
I didn't know that. Wow.
Yeah, it's called a square kilometre array, and both are lucky because we have very large expanses which are radio quiet, which is what you need, radio quiet zones, so that the radio waves don't interfere with the radio waves that are coming from space. And so in South Africa, the radio telescope is being built in the Karoo.
Yes.
And in Australia, it's in Western Australia. And together, it's going to be the largest radio telescope. So working together, I say Australia and South Africa will solve the mysteries of the universe.
I love that. I love that. That's awesome. So you have Australia has a prime minister, right? Not a president.
That's right. Yes, we still have the Queen as our head of state, like Canada.
Oh, okay.
Countries.
So it's similar to the UK.
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, really? Oh, wow. Okay, Commonwealth. Yeah, it makes sense. Okay. And the currency in Australia?
Yes, it's the Australian dollar. So.
Okay. Okay. And so once things do open up again, why would South Africans want to go and visit Australia? What are some of the places that they should be looking out for?
Wow. Look, I think there's, you know, just at Christmas, I was lucky before COVID and the border shut down to go on a great road trip with my family around South Africa. And we traveled, we did 4,000 kilometers. And it really struck me. I can see the similarities between Australia and South Africa when it comes to the tourism offering. So both sort of spectacular countries. We've got these big blue, wide open skies and open roads, wonderful landscapes, great coastal regions, wonderful food and wine. And I think so very similar to what you can see in Australia. So recently I was lucky to be able to go back to Australia to see my family who were there. And we did a road trip in New South Wales up to Byron Bay, looking at the beautiful coastline. We went inland to sort of subtropical rainforests. I think Australia has a bit of everything, just like South Africa, actually. We've got very arid areas where you can get stunning kind of desert landscapes. We also have subtropical rainforests. We have a very beautiful indigenous culture. So we've got a multicultural society. As I said, we've got, wonderful fresh produce like South Africa, great wine like South Africa. So a bit of a tourist paradise like South Africa.
It's just a plane ride. How long is that?
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's worth it. I've heard a lot of, I actually have to visit Australia when things open up again. I definitely want to come and visit and see, because as you say, there is a lot of similarities between South Africa and Australia. So I definitely, next year, once things are back to normal, well, if there is such a word, to come and visit. So yeah, I'll contact you before then to get some advice as to where to go.
And look, I think distance, people, yes, Australia is a continent. So if you go to the east coast of Australia from South Africa, that is a long haul. But if you went to Perth or Western Australia, it's probably not much longer than flying from Cape Town to London. Okay.
Yeah, so sometimes people, they say that land down under, and there's been songs about that by Men at Work, but I mean, it promotes Australia at the end of the day, which is good. So there we go. So being a lady in South Africa at the moment, in the world, being a diplomat, being a leader, a role model, we're on Women's Month in South Africa. How important is it for you as a female, as a lady, being in the role that you are? Do you think that should inspire other women to reach their full potential as well?
Oh, look, it is important. I think, I think there's a long way to go. And if I can inspire people, that's fantastic. Interestingly, we have a program in our foreign ministry called Women in Leadership that was only introduced about 5 years ago, so relatively new, to try and promote more women in leadership, not just in our foreign ministry, but as part of our overall foreign policy. So we had our first female foreign minister in 2013, and we've now got our second female foreign minister. And we only had our first female secretary of the department, so Director General, in 2015. Yes. So, which is quite surprising. And in 2015, only about a quarter of our embassies were headed by female ambassadors. And under our Women in Leadership program, we have sort of set targets. So not quotas, they're not compulsory, but targets to get more women into our senior executive service and as heads of mission. And so since 2015, applying those policies, we've now got close to gender parity when it comes to our heads of mission overseas. And that's only in 5 years. So it shows that those sorts of programs can help to move the dial when it comes to gender equality.
Gita Kamath, Australian High Commissioner, thank you very much for being on the show. I really do appreciate it. Thank you for your time and for sharing this amazing journey of yourself, but also Australia, South Africa. Thank you so much, Gita, and enjoy the rest of Women's Month. But let me just say that Women's Day should be every day.
I agree with you. Thanks a lot, Stephen.
Thank you, Gita. Take care. Thanks.
Right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.